Don't resist. Tonight you are mine. Apache giant widow said to virgin rancher. The sun hung low over the vast open prairie, casting a golden hue over the rolling hills and dusty trails that stretched as far as the eye could see. A cool breeze rustled the dry grasses, carrying with it the scent of the earth and the promise of solitude. On a modest ranch, tucked away in a quiet corner of the frontier, a young man worked tirelessly, trying to build a life for himself. His name was Thomas, a rancher who had left behind everything he knew to settle in this remote part of the world. Thomas had always dreamed of this life, a life of independence and freedom, but the reality of it was far different from what he had imagined. The isolation weighed heavily on him, and at times, the silence felt suffocating. He had come from a small town where the noise of people and activity never stopped. Here it was just him, the land, and the occasional passing traveler. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but still no sign of the community he had hoped to find. Thomas didn't mind the work itself. There was something satisfying about tending to the land, mending fences, and caring for the animals. But as the days dragged on, he found himself longing for companionship. The nights were the hardest. The vast expanse of the land under the starlit sky felt both beautiful and lonely. He had no family nearby, no friends to visit, and no one to share his thoughts with. His thoughts often wandered back to the days before he came to the ranch. He had been content then, in his own way, but there was always the nagging feeling that something was missing. Now that he was out here, it seemed that feeling was stronger than ever. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Thomas sat on his porch, gazing out over the land he had come to know so well. The chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush were the only sounds that broke the silence. As he sat there, his mind wandered again, wondering what the future held. Would he ever find a true purpose here, or was he destined to remain a solitary figure in the wilderness, just another face in the endless landscape? Suddenly, a rustling sound from the edge of his property pulled him from his thoughts. At first he thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. A shadow appeared in the distance, moving toward him with a steady pace. It was too large to be an animal, and too deliberate to be the wind. Thomas stood up, squinting into the fading light, trying to make sense of the figure approaching. The figure came into view, and for a moment, Thomas stood frozen. A woman. She was tall, taller than most men Thomas had ever known. Her posture was commanding, her stride confident as she made her way toward the ranch house. Dusk, she wore a long, weathered cloak that seemed to blend into the landscape itself, as if she were one with the earth. Her face was hard to read, but her eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Thomas from across the yard. Thomas's heart began to race. He had heard the stories, the rumors. There were whispers about a woman in these parts, a woman who had lost everything. The Apache giant widow, they called her. She was a figure of mystery, both feared and revered by those who knew her name.
They said she was a warrior, strong and fierce, with a reputation that kept people at bay.
Some claimed she could read a man's soul with a single glance, while others said she had the power to command respect without ever raising her voice. Thomas had never believed the stories, thinking them to be nothing more than local folklore meant to keep outsiders away. But as the woman drew nearer, he began to question everything he thought he knew about this land. He could feel the weight of her presence, like an unseen force that commanded attention. When she finally reached the porch, she stopped a few feet away from him, her eyes still locked on his. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, as though the entire world had paused to take in the scene. Thomas didn't know what to say. He had heard that the widow didn't speak much, that she kept to herself and only interacted with others when absolutely necessary. Yet here she was, standing before him as though she had every right to be. "Are you the new rancher?" she asked, her voice low and steady, but with a certain firmness that made it impossible to ignore. Thomas nodded slowly, trying to steady his nerves. "Bray." "Yes, ma'am, that would be me." The woman didn't move, her gaze still intense as she observed him. Thomas felt as if she were sizing him up, looking for something beyond the surface. He shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, unsure of what to expect.
"I've heard of you," she said, her tone flat. "You're the one who's been working this land alone."
"No one else around for miles, is that right?" Thomas nodded again. "That's right. It's just me and the land out here."
She studied him for a moment longer before speaking again.
"I've been watching you. You seem different from the others." Thomas frowned, unsure of how to take her words.
"What do you mean?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile.
"You're not like the others who come and go. You're not running from something."
You're here because you've chosen this life, but I wonder if you're ready for what comes with it.
Vibration. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Thomas couldn't quite understand why he felt so drawn to this woman, why her presence seemed to resonate within him. He had met many people in his life, but none like her, none who commanded such attention without even trying. "I'm just trying to build something here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I thought maybe this was the place I could find what I was looking for." The woman's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, but her expression quickly returned to its usual hard edge. "You'll find what you're looking for, but don't expect it to be easy. Life out here is not for the faint of heart."
"It will test you in ways you cannot imagine." She turned to leave, but before she did, she glanced over her shoulder, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. "Don't resist. Tonight you are mine." The words caught Thomas off guard. He stood there, rooted to the spot as she disappeared into the night.
The only sound left was the rustling of the wind through the grass. He was left standing there, staring into the darkness, his mind racing with questions he had no answers to. Who was this woman? What did she mean by her cryptic words? And why did he feel as if his life had just been irrevocably changed by a single encounter? As the night wore on, Thomas sat back down on the porch, his thoughts swirling. The air seemed different now, charged with the weight of the unknown.
He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would test him in ways he hadn't yet understood.
Pray. And somewhere in the back of his mind he couldn't help but wonder, was he ready for what lay ahead?
The days after the mysterious encounter with the giant Apache widow were a whirlwind for Thomas. Her words echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing moment. "Don't resist. Tonight, you are mine."
The phrase had become a riddle, a puzzle he couldn't solve. What did she mean? Breaths. Was it a warning? A challenge? Or was it something deeper? Something he couldn't yet understand? Thomas tried to shake off the lingering thoughts as he focused on his work. He had a ranch to maintain, cattle to tend to, and fences to repair. The land was vast, and it seemed that there was always something to do. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, he couldn't help but feel a strange pull in the back of his mind. There was something about the widow, something that made him both nervous and intrigued. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next. The morning sun would rise over the plains, and Thomas would begin his chores, lost in the routine of it all. But at night, when the stars hung high in the sky and the quiet of the desert settled around him, his thoughts would drift back to her. The widow was unlike any woman he had ever met. Breaths. She was tall, with an almost intimidating presence that commanded respect. Her eyes were sharp, like a hawk's, and they seemed to see right through him. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in the presence of another person. He had heard stories of her, of course. The locals spoke of her in hushed tones, telling tales of her strength and her fierce independence. Some said she had once been a warrior, leading her people in battle before losing everything. Her husband, a fellow Apache warrior, had been killed in a raid, leaving her alone in a world that no longer seemed to have a place for her. Since then, she had wandered the land, a shadow of her former self, both feared and respected by the people who crossed her path. But despite the stories, there was something about the widow that didn't add up. She wasn't just a figure of fear and mystery. There was more to her, something beneath the surface that Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on. It was a feeling, a sense that she was searching for something too. Maybe it was the same thing he was searching for: purpose, connection, a sense of belonging. As the days went by, Thomas couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. He had to know more. He had to understand her. But how? He couldn't just go looking for her. The widow didn't seem like the type of woman who would appreciate being hunted down. No. She was the one who did the hunting. She was the one who controlled the situation. He would have to wait, he realized, to let fate bring them together again. And, sure enough, fate had a way of making things happen. A week after their first encounter, Thomas was out in the fields, repairing a broken fence when he heard a horse's hooves approaching. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but then the sound grew louder, closer. He turned around to see a lone rider cutting through the tall grass toward him. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized her. The widow was back. This time she wasn't just a shadow in the distance. She was right there, riding towards him on horseback, her long cloak billowing in the wind. The sight of her sent a jolt of electricity through Thomas's body. She was even more imposing up close, sitting tall in the saddle with a posture that spoke of years of strength and resilience. She was a woman who had lived through pain, through loss, and had come out the other side stronger for it. When she reached him, she dismounted gracefully, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. Her eyes, dark and intense, locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though the entire world had paused, waiting for something to happen. "You've been thinking about me," she said, her voice steady and sure. Bonus dispatched, Thomas opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat.
He had been thinking about her, of course, but he hadn't expected her to say it so plainly.
He wasn't sure what to say.
I don't know what to think.
I know, but that's why I'm here. You're not the first man to be confused by me, but I'm not here to confuse you. I'm here to show you something. Thomas furrowed his brow, unsure of what she meant. Show me what? She took a step closer, and for the first time Thomas noticed the subtle softness in her expression. It was fleeting, but it was there. It made him wonder if he had been wrong to see her only as a warrior, as someone who was always strong and unyielding. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to her than that. "Come with me," she said, her voice low, almost inviting. "I want to show you something that will change the way you see this land." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward her horse. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then followed. His heart raced, a mixture of excitement and apprehension flooding through him. But he didn't know where she was taking him, but he knew he couldn't turn back now.
There was something about her, something about this moment, that he couldn't resist. They rode in silence for a while, the landscape unfolding before them as they traveled deeper into the wilderness. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the earth. Breaths. Thomas tried to keep his focus on the trail ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the widow. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something momentous, something that could change his life forever. Finally, they arrived at a clearing. The widow dismounted first and led her horse to a nearby rock, tying it loosely to a tree. She motioned for Thomas to follow, and he did, his curiosity piqued. In the middle of the clearing stood a large, flat rock, its surface smooth and worn by years of wind and rain. The widow gestured to it. "Sit." Thomas sat down, still unsure of what was happening.
The widow stood over him, her eyes watching him closely.
"You've come here to find yourself," she said, her voice soft but firm.
"And this land will show you who you are. But you must learn to see it for what it is, not what you want it to be." Thomas was confused.
"What do you mean?" The widow sighed and sat beside him. "This land is wild.
Untamed. It doesn't care about you or your dreams.
It's just here. But if you learn to respect it, if you learn to be a part of it, it will teach you things you can't even imagine. Things about yourself, things about life."
Thomas looked out over the land, the endless horizon stretching before him.
For the first time since he had arrived, he felt a sense of calm wash over him.
The widow was right.
He had come here looking for something, but he hadn't known what. Maybe he hadn't been searching for a future at all. Maybe he had been searching for a way to belong, a way to be part of something bigger than himself. He looked at her, finally understanding. "I don't know if I can ever fully understand this place, but maybe that's okay." The widow nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips.
"It's not about understanding it all.
It's about living in it, being a part of it. Free, just like I am." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the wilderness surrounded them, the only sounds the rustling of the wind and the distant call of birds.
In that moment, Thomas realized that the widow wasn't just showing him the land.
She was showing him himself. The days following that moment in the clearing were like a blur to Thomas. What had started as an ordinary day on the ranch had turned into something far more significant. The widow's words lingered in his mind, as did the quiet strength she had shown in that secluded part of the wilderness. It was as if she had shared something profound with him, something he hadn't fully understood yet, but something that would change his life forever. Thomas went back to his work on the ranch, but his routine felt different now. It was as if the land had a voice that spoke to him in ways he hadn't noticed before. The rhythm of his tasks, feeding the cattle, mending the fences, tending to the crops seemed more connected, more meaningful. He found himself thinking back to the widow's advice. "It's not about understanding it all," she had said. Breath. "It's about living in it." At first he had thought those words were cryptic, just another piece of the puzzle that was the widow, but now he understood them better. The land wasn't something to conquer. It wasn't something to be tamed. It was something to be respected, to be worked alongside, not against. Every day as he walked the fields, as he fed the cattle or repaired a broken fence, he felt a quiet, steady connection to the earth beneath him. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, a bond that was more profound than anything he had ever experienced. And all the while, he couldn't stop thinking about the widow. She had appeared out of nowhere, a towering figure who seemed to embody everything the land represented: strength, resilience, and the untamed wild. But there was more to her than that. She was a woman who had lived through pain, loss, and survival, and yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made Thomas respect her deeply. The widow wasn't just a figure to be feared. She was a living testament to the hardships the land could bring. But there was a gentleness in her that made her seem human, too. She wasn't just a warrior or a giant. She was someone who had been shaped by her experiences. Someone who had learned to survive not by controlling the world around her, but by accepting it as it was.
As the days passed, Thomas felt an increasing desire to learn more from her.
It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a need to understand the depth of her character, to learn from her experiences. But he wasn't sure how to approach her. The widow was not a woman who could be easily found. She didn't live by any set schedule, and she didn't seem to come into town very often. He would have to be patient, he realized. If he wanted to learn more, he would have to wait for the next time their paths crossed. Then, just as he was starting to feel as though he had grown accustomed to the solitude of the ranch, she appeared again. It was late in the afternoon, and Thomas had just finished fixing a fence when he heard the sound of hooves approaching. This time, he was prepared. His heart began to race as the widow's figure emerged from the horizon, her silhouette cutting through the dimming light like a shadow from another time. She was riding at a steady pace, her long cloak flowing behind her like a dark wave. Breath. She reached the ranch house without any words. Her horse's hooves clopped against the dusty ground, breaking the silence that had been hanging in the air. As she dismounted, she didn't look at Thomas immediately. She stood still for a moment, her hands resting on the reins, as if contemplating something. "Good evening," Thomas said, his voice a little shaky from the sudden rush of emotions. It had been days since he had seen her, but the mere sight of her still unsettled him. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. The widow finally looked at him, her eyes piercing and unwavering. "I've come to check on you," she said, her voice steady and calm.
"You seem to be doing well here. The land is agreeing with you, I think."
Thomas wasn't sure what to say to that. He had no answer to give other than a simple nod. He had worked hard, and the land had begun to yield its rewards. The cattle were growing strong, the crops were healthy, and the ranch was beginning to look like a true home. But it wasn't just the work that had changed him. It was the way he viewed the world now, the way he saw his place in it.
"I've been thinking about what you said," he said after a long pause. "About living in the land, not understanding it all. I think I'm starting to get it. It's not about controlling things.
It's about letting go, being a part of something bigger." The widow studied him for a long moment, as though weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "You're learning," she said simply. Thomas felt a strange sense of pride at her words. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had acknowledged that he was starting to understand, that he was on the right path. It was more than he had expected, and for some reason it meant more to him than anything else she could have said. The widow didn't stay long that day. After a few minutes of silent observation, she began to mount her horse again, but before she rode off into the horizon, she turned to him, her gaze softer than before. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying over the wind, "the land will always teach you, but only if you are willing to listen. It will not give you answers. It will only give you challenges. And how you face them will determine the kind of person you become." Thomas watched her ride off, the silhouette of her figure gradually fading into the distance. He stood there for a long while, the evening sky turning darker by the minute. The words she had spoken echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he understood the weight of them. The widow wasn't just giving him advice. She was giving him a glimpse of her life, A life shaped by the land's challenges. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a life of purpose.
For days after her visit, Thomas reflected on her words.
He began to approach his work on the ranch with a newfound sense of determination. Every task, no matter how small, became an opportunity to learn, to grow. He saw the land as something to conquer. Instead, he saw it as a teacher, one that would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine.
But more than that, Thomas began to realize that the widow had taught him something important about himself. He had come to the ranch to escape the noise of the world, to find peace in the solitude.
But in the process, he had also found strength in the land, in the animals, and in himself. He wasn't just building a ranch. He was building a life.
One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Thomas sat on the porch, looking out over the land.
The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, and the air was cool and crisp. He felt at peace for the first time in a long while. And though the widow had left, her presence lingered in his thoughts. He could still feel her words, still feel the weight of the lessons she had shared. Frowned. In desk, Thomas knew he wasn't finished yet. He had a long way to go before he could truly understand the land, but he was no longer afraid of the challenges that lay ahead. He was ready to face whatever came his way, and ready to listen to the land as it spoke to him.
The days seemed to blur into one another as Thomas worked tirelessly on his ranch. The steady rhythm of daily tasks, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, and tending to the crops, had become second nature. Yet, despite the calm and satisfaction he found in his work, a part of him felt that something was still missing. He was no longer the same man who had first set foot on this land, driven by dreams of solitude and escape. Now he felt an unspoken connection to the place, a connection that had grown deeper with each passing day. But there was more to it than that. The widow's words still echoed in his mind. The land will always teach you, but only if you are willing to listen. In those moments of stillness when he paused his work to take in the vastness of the landscape, he began to realize how true those words were. The land wasn't just a backdrop to his life. It was a part of him. It spoke to him through the wind that rustled the tall grasses, through the quiet hum of the earth beneath his boots. The land had become his teacher, his guide. But still, the widow's presence lingered in his thoughts. It had been a few weeks since she had last visited. Her appearance had been brief, but it had left a lasting impression. Thomas found himself wondering about her, thinking about the life she had led, the losses she had endured, the strength she had found in herself. She had shown him a side of the world that he had never fully understood, one that went beyond the ordinary tasks of ranching. It was a world where resilience and survival were the only things that mattered. As the days turned to weeks, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. He had learned so much already, but there was still so much he wanted to understand. And the widow, with her quiet wisdom, seemed to be the key to unlocking that understanding. But how would he find her again?
He couldn't just wait for fate to bring her to him. The land, though beautiful and vast, could be unforgiving, and Thomas knew that if he wanted to continue learning, he had to take matters into his own hands.
One morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Thomas decided to take a different approach. He saddled his horse, packed a small bag with supplies, and set out in the direction he believed the widow had come from during their last encounter. He had no map, no clear path to follow, only the faint hope that he might find her again. He rode through the open plains, the wind whipping at his face, and the sounds of the land all around him. The rhythmic clopping of his horse's hooves against the earth became the soundtrack of his journey. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself deep in the wilderness, far beyond the reach of his ranch. The land here was even more remote, the rolling hills and sparse trees giving way to untamed wilderness. He had ridden for hours, and though the landscape was breathtaking,
He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested.
Breath. The land, as the widow had said, was relentless. It didn't care about his intentions or his struggles.
It simply was. His horse grew tired as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Thomas knew he had to find shelter soon. He came across a small grove of trees and decided to set up camp there. He tied his horse to a nearby branch and built a small fire, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the stillness of the evening. As he sat by the fire, he couldn't help but think about the widow. Had she been through these same trials? Had she faced the same challenges and learned to survive in this harsh, unforgiving land? The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the trees, and Thomas stared into its flames, lost in thought.
It wasn't until the quiet of the night had settled fully around him that he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching in the distance.
Desk. He stood up, startled, and quickly looked around. There, emerging from the darkness, was the widow, riding towards him at a steady pace. This time, she didn't dismount right away. She stayed mounted, her posture as commanding as ever. Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them, as though this meeting had been inevitable.
Thomas stood, his heart racing.
"I didn't expect to find you out here," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened at the sight of her. The widow looked at him for a moment before responding. "I knew you would come looking for me eventually. The land speaks to those who listen. But not everyone has the courage to follow its call." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward her. Breath. She had known.
She had known that he would seek her out, that he would need to learn more from her.
I've been thinking about what you said, Thomas admitted.
About living in the land, not trying to control it. I thought I understood, but now I'm not so sure.
There's still so much I don't understand. I need to learn more.
I need to know how to live with it, how to survive it, like you have. The widow dismounted and walked over to the fire. She didn't speak right away, as if she were weighing his words. Finally, she sat down across from him, her gaze steady. "You think survival is about strength, about conquering what's in your way. But that's only part of it. To truly survive this land, you have to learn to bend with it, to adapt to its rhythms. You can't fight it. You have to live with it." Thomas listened closely, taking in her words. He had always thought of survival as something physical, something that required strength and determination. But now he saw that survival was more than that. It was about understanding the world around you, respecting it, and learning how to flow with it rather than against it. "I've watched you," the widow continued. "You've come a long way since you first arrived. But there's still more to learn. The land will show you things, but you have to be willing to face them. You have to be willing to confront the parts of yourself you're afraid of." Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest. There were parts of himself he hadn't wanted to face. The doubts, the fears, the questions about whether he was truly capable of making this land his home. He had always tried to push those thoughts away, bury them under the weight of his work. But the widow was right. To truly survive here, he had to face those parts of himself head-on.
"I don't know if I'm ready for that," he said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The widow's gaze softened, but only for a moment.
"No one is ever truly ready."
That's what makes it so difficult. But that's also what makes it worth it. Brain. The challenge, the struggle, it all shapes you into something stronger, something greater than you were before.
She stood up, brushing the dirt from her cloak.
"Tomorrow we will go further into the wilderness. You will see more of what this land has to offer, and more of what you must learn." Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. For the first time since he had arrived in this wild place, he felt as though he was beginning to understand it. Not just the land, but himself! The widow had shown him that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about learning, growing, and accepting the challenges that life threw at you. Bay.
As the night grew deeper and the fire burned lower, Thomas felt a new sense of purpose rising within him. He wasn't alone out here.
The land, the widow, he had found something he hadn't expected. Something that would change the course of his life. And with that thought, he allowed himself to close his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more lessons, more challenges. But for the first time, he was ready to face them. The following days spent with the widow were unlike any Thomas had ever experienced. The journey deeper into the wilderness had been challenging, but it had also been revealing. The land, with all its harshness and beauty, was no longer just a backdrop to his existence. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that demanded respect and patience. And as he learned to adapt, to listen to its subtle cues, he began to feel a sense of connection he had never imagined.
Every day was a lesson.
They walked for miles through the untamed forests, the dense undergrowth making their progress slow but steady. The widow taught him how to read the signs in nature, how to spot animal tracks, how to identify plants that could be used for food or medicine. But she showed him the importance of patience, of moving with the land rather than against it. At times, Thomas felt as though he were learning more in those few days than he had in his entire life. It was as if the widow were not just teaching him about the land, but about himself. One afternoon, as they stopped to rest by a small stream, the widow sat down beside him. Her eyes, always so intense, seemed to soften as she gazed out over the water. Thomas noticed how the sunlight danced on the surface of the stream, how the ripples seemed to mirror the subtle changes in the wind. The quiet was soothing, and for the first time, he truly felt at peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore.
He was living. You've come far, the widow said, breaking the silence.
You've learned to listen, to feel the land. But you've only scratched the surface. Breath. There is still much you must understand. Thomas nodded, grateful for her guidance.
I think I'm starting to understand, he said quietly. But there's still so much I don't know. I've spent so much of my life trying to make things happen on my own. I thought I could control everything, but now I see that it's not about control.
Death, it's about coexistence. The widow glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Exactly. The land is not something you control.
It is something you live with. You must learn to bend with it, to let it shape you, just as it has shaped me.
For a long time they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle flow of the stream and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Thomas thought about what the widow had said. She had been through so much in her life. Loss, hardship, survival, and yet she had found a way to thrive in the harshest of environments. It wasn't her strength alone that had kept her alive. It was her ability to adapt, to accept the challenges, and to grow from them. Thomas thought about the ranch best. When he had first arrived, it had seemed like a place to escape, a place to leave behind his old life. But now, as he sat beside the widow in the quiet of the wilderness, he realized that the ranch was more than just a refuge. It was a place of growth, a place where he could learn and change. It wasn't just about building something physical, it was about building himself.
Do you ever miss your old life?
Thomas asked, his voice soft. He wasn't sure why he asked the question, but it had been on his mind for some time. He had never known the widow's past, never known what had brought her to this point. It seemed only natural to ask now, when they were both at a point of reflection. The widow didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up and walked a few paces away, her eyes focused on the horizon. Wait. unsure if she would respond at all. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "I miss parts of it," she said quietly. "I miss the people I loved, the life I once knew, but I've come to accept that those things are gone. I can't change what's happened, and I can't go back. All I have now is this land, and the strength I found in it." Her words struck a chord deep within Thomas. He realized that she too had experienced loss. She had lost everything once, and yet here she was, standing strong in the face of it all. She had rebuilt her life, not by holding on to the past, but by accepting it and moving forward. Thomas stood up and joined her by the stream, his heart heavy with the weight of her words.
"I've been running from my past," he admitted. "I thought coming out here would give me a fresh start, that I could escape who I was.
But now I see that running away doesn't make the past disappear. It just keeps following you." The widow turned to face him, her gaze sharp and piercing.
You can't outrun your past.
"It will always be a part of you, no matter where you go. The key is not to forget it, but to accept it. To let it shape you, not break you." Her words resonated with Thomas more than anything else she had said. He had spent so long trying to outrun the mistakes and regrets of his past, trying to build a new life without confronting the old one. But the widow was right. He couldn't keep running. He had to face what had happened, and in doing so, he would find the strength to move forward. The next few days were spent with a renewed sense of purpose. The widow continued to teach Thomas, showing him how to survive in the wilderness, how to live with the land. But beyond the practical lessons, she was teaching him something deeper. She was teaching him how to embrace life as it came, with all its challenges, its beauty, and its pain. One evening, as they made camp near a small hill, Thomas found himself thinking about the widow's words. He realized that his journey wasn't just about surviving in the wilderness or building a successful ranch. It was about learning to live with the world around him, to accept the parts of himself he had been running from, and to grow stronger because of them. As the fire crackled and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Thomas sat beside the widow, both of them watching the night unfold in quiet contemplation. He felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he had learned to accept the imperfections. Rest. He had learned to let go of the things he couldn't control and to embrace the life he had now. "I think I'm ready," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady with newfound conviction. "Ready to make this place my home. Ready to live with it, not against it." The widow turned to look at him, her eyes filled with something that almost resembled approval. "You've come a long way," she said softly. Burst.
"There will always be more to learn."
Desk. More to discover. Thomas nodded, understanding that the road ahead would never be easy, but he was no longer afraid of the challenges. He knew that he could face whatever came his way, as long as he remembered the lessons the widow had taught him. And as he sat there watching the fire burn low and the stars rise higher in the sky, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was no longer running from his past. He had embraced it, learned from it, and let it shape him into the man he was becoming. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the land and the widow's teachings would always be there to guide him,